In 2020, the entire world stopped. Schools closed, borders shut, streets that normally held millions of people went completely silent. For most people alive today, it felt unprecedented, like something no generation had ever faced before. It wasn't even close. Long before COVID, before the Black Death turned medieval Europe into a burial ground, before smallpox erased entire civilizations that had existed for thousands of years, disease was already doing something far larger than killing people. It was shaping us, rewriting our bodies, our behavior, our cultures, and our genetics in ways that are still running inside you right now. Because here's the question nobody asks once a pandemic is over. What does disease actually do to a species over time? The answer is stranger and more permanent than most people ever realize. For most of human history, ancient humans lived in small, mobile bands, usually between 20 and 50 people, constantly moving across vast landscapes. In that world, a pathogen could only spread as far as its host could walk. If a virus burned through your group, it died with them. No city to flee to, no trade route to follow, no port to sail from. That changed roughly 12,000 years ago. Agriculture. When humans stopped moving and started farming, they built permanent settlements. Populations grew dense. And for the first time in human history, large numbers of people were living in close quarters, next to their animals, their waste, and their dead. Disease found conditions it had never seen before, and it evolved fast to take advantage of them. Here's something most people have never been told. The majority of the infectious diseases that killed the most humans in history didn't start in humans. They came from animals. Smallpox from rodents, influenza from birds and pigs, measles from cattle, tuberculosis from cattle, the Black Death from fleas carried on rats. Anthropologists call this zoonotic spillover, when a pathogen jumps from an animal host into a human population it has never encountered before. And the moment humans began living alongside domesticated livestock, those spillovers accelerated dramatically. Think about that for a second. Every farm animal your ancestors kept, cattle, pigs, chickens, sheep, was a potential biological bridge between the animal world and the human immune system. And for thousands of years, nobody had any idea that was happening. They just kept getting sick, and enough of them kept surviving to rebuild. In ancient civilizations, disease didn't just kill people. It dismantled power. The Antonine Plague swept through the Roman Empire between 165 and 180 AD. At its peak, it was killing roughly 2,000 people a day inside Rome alone. Over its course, it erased an estimated 5 million lives, somewhere between a quarter and a third of the entire empire's population. Military recruitment collapsed. Agricultural labor vanished. Tax revenue dried up. Historians now argue the Antonine Plague was one of the first major structural fractures in a civilization that would eventually fall apart completely. Rome is not the exception. It's the pattern. The Plague of Justinian in 541 AD killed between 25 and 50 million people and gutted the Byzantine Empire's attempt to rebuild the old Roman world. The Black Death in the 14th century killed somewhere between 30 and 60% of Europe's entire population, up to 200 million people. And the consequences reshuffled civilization so completely that some historians trace the beginning of the Renaissance directly to it. When half the workforce disappears, land becomes cheap, labor becomes scarce. Surviving peasants suddenly have bargaining power they could never have imagined before. New ideas fill the space where old ones died. Disease didn't just thin the herd. It rearranged who held power, who owned land, and who got a voice. But here's what's more interesting than the history. What disease did to your actual body. Your immune system is not the same as your ancestors' immune system. Not even close. Every time a pandemic swept through a population, it filtered the survivors. The people who lived passed their genetics forward. The people who died didn't. Over generations, this created populations with dramatically different immune profiles, depending entirely on which pathogens their bloodline had already survived. Scientists call it pathogen-driven natural selection, and it is one of the most powerful forces that has ever shaped human genetics. A 2015 study published in PLOS Genetics analyzed ancient DNA from European populations before and after the Black Death. Researchers found clear and measurable evidence that the plague created intense selective pressure on specific immune genes. Variants that helped people survive became dramatically more common in post-plague populations within just a few generations. That is evolution happening fast enough for modern scientists to read it in the bones of people who died 700 years ago. Your immune system carries the memory of every major plague your bloodline survived. Not as a conscious memory, as code. As the difference between your body recognizing a pathogen in hours versus not recognizing it at all. And here's the part nobody talks about after a pandemic ends. COVID-19 was not the Black Death, but it still killed more than 7 million people globally in its first years, and it did not kill them randomly. It killed according to patterns, genetics, age, pre-existing immune conditions, which means the survivors were not a random sample of the global population. They were a filtered sample. In a single generation, that filtering is invisible, but across hundreds of generations, across thousands of years, of pandemic after pandemic after pandemic layering on top of each other, that's how you got your immune system. That's why some people seem to catch everything while others shrug off the same exposure. You are, in part, the cumulative sum of every disease that killed your ancestors, and every person in your bloodline who survived it. But disease didn't stop at biology. It changed how humans think about each other. Psychologists have a concept called the behavioral immune system, a set of deeply instinctive responses your brain runs to detect and avoid infection before you ever get physically sick. Disgust, wariness of unfamiliar people, heightened attention to signs of illness in others. These aren't just social quirks. They're ancient threat detection software running in your cognition without your awareness. In populations that historically faced higher disease loads, more frequent outbreaks, more lethal ones, researchers have consistently found stronger tendencies towards social conformity, tighter in-group loyalty, and more caution toward outsiders. Not because those cultures consciously chose those values, but because communities built that way survived pandemics better than communities that weren't. Think about what that actually means. The social values that define entire civilizations, how openly people trust strangers, how rigidly they follow shared rules, how quickly they accept or reject the unfamiliar, were partly shaped by which diseases tore through those populations thousands of years before anyone alive today was born. Every pandemic leaves a behavioral scar on the culture that survives it. For most of human history, people had no idea what was killing them. Germ theory, the understanding that invisible microorganisms cause infectious disease, wasn't confirmed until the 1860s. For thousands of years before that, humans attributed plagues to bad air, divine punishment, poisoned water, and cosmic misalignment. And yet, they survived. Generation after generation, through pandemics that emptied cities and erased empires, through fevers that killed 1 in 3 people in a single winter, through invisible enemies that had no name and no face. They survived not because they understood what was happening to them, but because enough of them were built to outlast it. Your ancestors lived through every pandemic in human history. Every single one. The ones that cracked Rome, the ones that burned through medieval Europe, the ones that killed 50 million people in 1918 in under a year. They passed something forward, not just their genetics, their tendency to rebuild, their instinct to keep forming communities and families and civilizations, even knowing what dense populations invite. The next pandemic will not begin in some future year. It began 12,000 years ago, on the first morning a human woke up next to a domesticated animal, and breathed the same air. That morning never ended. The shaping never stopped. You are what survived.